So today I'm going to talk about the weirdest Christian doctrine that you've probably never heard of, which is the doctrine of divine simplicity. I had somebody ask for me to talk about this in the comments of my last video, so here we go. So the doctrine of divine simplicity, it says that anything internal to God is identical to God, and that there is no differentiation in God whatsoever. But what does that mean? Well, let's start with attributes. So we often talk about God having attributes such as omniscience, omnipotence, omnibenevolence, so on and so forth. Divine simplicity says that all of these are identical to one another and identical to God. All of God's actions, such as God's act of creating the world, God's act of sending Jesus, God's act of answering a prayer, these are all identical to one another and also somehow identical to God. Divine simplicity says there is one act, one divine act, and that one divine act is also identical to God's existence. Divine simplicity denies that God has properties or that God has any potentiality. God is simply pure act. So what should we make of this doctrine? Well, I think it's pretty weird. Most of the time when I describe this to people who have never heard of it before, I get some raised eyebrows. So where does this idea come from? Well, it doesn't come from scripture. It comes from the influence of Greek philosophical thought early in Christian history. And there have been many prominent historical Christians who have endorsed this idea, but it's not without its problems. So right off the bat, this doctrine strikes me as just nonsensical. I don't even think it's coherent. But setting that aside, one might note that if there is no differentiation in God, it seems pretty difficult to have a Trinity. And this is an area that I think proponents of divine simplicity have struggled with for a long time. But there is also a major objection to this doctrine that has plagued it also for a very long time. And this objection is called the modal collapse objection. So the essential idea with this objection is this. So Christianity has long affirmed the idea that the universe was created by God, it's not past eternal, and God could have not created it. God could have created something completely different or nothing at all. Christians also think that God didn't have to save us or he didn't have to die for us, but this is a freely given act based on his love. God doesn't have to answer your prayers. If he does, that's great, but he could have not answered those prayers. In fact, we think often there are a lot of things that are the case that didn't have to be the case. But divine simplicity actually undercuts all of these ideas because divine simplicity makes all of God's actions and kind of everything necessary. And our reasoning can go something like this. Well, God is necessary and God is identical to his actions. So all of God's actions are necessary. But God's creation of the world is one of his actions, so it's necessary that God created the world. And then you can repeat this reasoning with any action you wish or pretty much anything in reality. And so what we end up getting is a world in which just everything is necessary. Things could have never been any different. And I think this obviously strikes us as wrong for a variety of reasons. If you want to know more about this idea and objections to it and how people have responded to those objections, I recommend checking out the work of Ryan Mullins. He is a scholar who has written extensively on this topic, and he has a podcast called the Reluctant Theologian Podcast, which is fantastic. And he also has done a lot of interviews, which you can find on YouTube. That's all I have for this video. Please feel free to mention things you would like for me to talk about in the comments.